Hi, I'm Terry. Welcome to the Key Biscayne Historical and Heritage Society. Today we're at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Gordon Reed here on Key Biscayne. They've been residents since 1952. They have lots of stories to tell, lots of tales to tell. It's going to be a fun day.
I'm Prudence Gill, and I'm here on Key Biscayne on Glen Ridge Road with the Reed family today. And I am a native of Key Biscayne, but I've known the Reed family since I was in nursery school at Little Island Playhouse when Jan and I met and became really good friends. And so I want to introduce them, and then we're going to talk through their story, which is a fabulous story about how they got to Key Biscayne. This is Beth Reed
Hello.
on the right, Jan Reed across the table, and Gordon Reed here on the left. The first question I want to ask is, Mr. Reed, how did you, a Midwesterner, end up here on Key Biscayne and wanting to come to the Tropics?
Well, uh, I met Beth. I was going to school in Indiana at West Lafayette, Indiana.
What school was that?
That was Purdue University. Then I graduated in 1950 and got a job in Chicago. We got married in 1951. We had our honeymoon was spent in Miami. Beth had a girlfriend that was out here on Key Biscayne, living out here on Key Biscayne, and we visited with them. And then we went back to Chicago. Asked that she would like to live in Florida. So, Florida sounded good to me after spending so much time in the South Pacific where you had such high temperatures. I had become used to it. So we rented a trailer and filled the trailer up and hooked it on behind the car and filled it up full of all of our junk, and then we took off for Florida.
That's
And
great.
this was in 1952.
52.
And we got down here and visited with our friends Norm and Evelyn Casper. Decided to buy a house, and so I had enough money saved up from the 4 years of World War II, and we bought this place, and we've been here ever since.
Can I ask, how did you end up first coming to Florida?
After I graduated from college, Grinnell College in Iowa, and my friend Evelyn, then Faulkner, she had vacationed in Palm Beach. And she said it was just wonderful. And she said, why don't we go to Florida? We didn't have jobs. And so we thought, well, what can we do? And so we thought, well, we both had graduated with English degrees in comparative literature. And so we thought, well, maybe we could teach school. And so we figured out that in Florida, the schools were all controlled by the counties. And so we sent a letter to the superintendent of instruction in every county in Florida. And we got 2 responses. One was from Kissimmee, Florida, and the other one was from Weewahitchka, Florida. Well, we looked them up on the map, and Kissimmee was right in the middle of all the swamps, and we thought, well, gee, we don't really want to we wanted to be on the coast, because that's where she had spent time in Palm Beach. And so we decided we would accept the jobs in Weewahitchka, because that was up in the Panhandle, but it was only like about 20 miles from the Gulf Coast. So we thought, well, at least that puts us close to the beach. So her father bought us a little 1936 Ford, which looks like a VW. So we packed our things and we were ready to leave from Indiana And the night before we were going to leave, we got a telegram from the school in Weewahitchka saying, sorry, we filled those positions, don't bother to come. So we thought, whew. So we decided to pretend we didn't get the telegram, and we just took off. And when it took us several days to drive to Florida, and we did fun things along the way, like stopping in Mammoth Cave and stuff like that. And so then we were finally approaching Weewahitchka, and it was toward the end of the day, and it was twilight, and we came to what they called the Dead Lakes. Well, we didn't know what the heck that was. Well, and then we drove through the Dead Lakes, and it was water with dead tree stumps in them. I guess there must have been a dam someplace, you know, that flooded the forest. Well, anyway, so we drove for what, a half hour, 45 minutes through the Dead Lakes, and then we came to Weewahitchka, which was a little tiny town, but right in the middle of it, there was this great big red building, wood frame, that said Weewahitchka Hotel. And so we thought, well, at least we can spend the night here. And I said to Evelyn, well, we can do that, but the minute we go in, they'll know who we are. And she said, how could they possibly know what we're complete strangers? And I said, Evelyn, I grew up in a little town. And I said, the minute we walk in, they will know who we are.
Yeah.
And so we walked in, and the dining room was a big room with a high ceiling, and it had big square tables in it, all with oilcloth tablecloths on. Do you know what oilcloth is? Yeah, okay. And so we sat down, and a little girl came over, who was probably 12 or 13 years old, and sat down with us to take our order. And so we ordered our food, and the only other people in there was another table over to the side, and it had maybe 6, 7 people sitting there, women and men. And I said to Evelyn, that's the teacher's table. And she said, what do you mean? I said, believe me, that's the teacher's table. And then I had to go to the restroom. And so the girl told me where to go in, and I went in, and it was kind of a big bathroom that was divided. And here was the tub, and there was a little girl about 6 years old sitting there having her bath. So we had this little conversation, and then I went through the door where the toilet was, you know. So anyway, we had our dinner, and we were just finishing, and a couple of people from the other table came over to say, are you by any chance the girls from Indiana?
They could tell.
And we said yes, and they said, well, you know, but I said, we heard that the positions had been filled. And they said, well, I think you should come by and talk to the principal in the morning. There might be something. By this time, we said, okay, thank you. And so we spent the night there. And the next morning, we drove around the school, which was a perfectly nice school, but there was no way these 2 recent graduates from college were going to spend any time more in Weewahitchka, Florida.
One night was enough.
One night was enough. So we left, and we hip-hopped down the Florida Peninsula looking for jobs all along the way in college towns. And we finally got to Miami, and we decided, well, this was kind of the end of the road. So we stayed here until we found jobs. And that in and itself is a long story and fun. But anyway, we did live here for a year. This was in 1948, 49.
Did you find teaching jobs, or did you do anything?
No, we did all kinds of things. We were dispatchers for a little cab company. We tutored. The upshot was we were here. My first introduction to Key Biscayne was then.
So we have reconvened in the Reed's living room, and Mrs. Reed had just finished with having arrived in Miami and some jobs here, and I was wondering if you visited Key Biscayne at that time.
before you headed back north.
Yes, I did. They had just opened the causeway after the war. And so they had opened Crandon Park Beach. And we used to come out here to go swimming at Crandon Park Beach during that year when we came often. And at that time, you could only go as far as the circle. That was the turnaround point. And then you had to go back to Miami. But that was my first introduction to Key Biscayne. Then we went back north, and we ended up, both of us, Evelyn's sister was married, and they were going to school at Purdue, and so we went back there, and we both got jobs at Purdue University. And that's where I was working when I met Gordon. And Evelyn met her husband there. Evelyn talked Norman into coming back down to Florida because we had both loved Florida so much.
And then the first moment you saw Mr. Reed.
Well, no. It was a blind date. And yes, we had fun. And then we had a subsequent date. And it turned out that my sister had been spending the summer with us in Lafayette. And
With you and Evelyn?
with Evelyn and I. He came to pick me up, but my sister was downstairs. And he thought she was me.
Wait, this was for the blind date or for the second
The
date?
second
Oh my
date.
gosh.
The second date. Of course, I will have to say that we did look an awful lot alike. But anyway, we dated for quite a while, and then he went to Chicago and had his job, and I was going to go off to graduate school, but it turned out that we forgot all that stuff and we got married. And we came to Key Biscayne for our honeymoon
For the
trip.
honeymoon.
And we visited Norm and Evelyn Caspin, who had a house over on Woodcrest. And at that time, the canal still went down Heather Drive.
Oh.
Heather Drive was a canal. That's why it's so straight. And at that time, there were no houses on the other side of Heather Drive. And the dredge was out in the bay, pumping the sand in for the property on the north side of Heather Drive. But when we were at Norman and Evelyn's that year, we could see the bay from their house on Woodcrest Drive.
Everything was
Just flat.
Yeah,
You know, it
yeah.
was the canal, and that was
Mhm.
the sand. They were pumping it in there. And we could see the lights on the dredge at night. It was very pretty. And you could see all the way down to where the yacht club is now. And they had that little canal next to the yacht club, and it had a little thatched building on it. I think that's where they used to load the coconuts and take them out. And so that little building was
still there.
Still there, yes. And so we went back to North, and both of us, and quit our jobs. And the next summer, we moved down to Key Biscayne.
That's excellent.
Oh, yes.
I was actually going to say, I think this is your 67th year of marriage,
Yes, we just had our 67th wedding anniversary.
which is fantastic.
I didn't have a job at first, so he immediately got a job with Florida Power and Light when we moved down. And I had grown up in a small town bank, and I had learned how to do mechanical bookkeeping. The banks all had mechanical bookkeeping machines. And that's, I always knew I could go in and get a job doing that almost anywhere. And I had done that up in Illinois. So I went here and got a job at the First National Bank downtown doing mechanical bookkeeping for a while. And then I quit and I got a job over at the Miami Beach Public Library.
Oh,
And I worked there until Jan was born. So that was the kind of job I had here.
you were active in the community in so many different roles. At least I remember this when I was growing up, and then you had this whole other part that came afterwards. So to share some of that.
Well, about what life was like here on Key Biscayne.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I remember Gordon saying, the fellows from the office said, I would never buy my way home every night.
The nickel.
The nickel.
Yeah, the nickel for the
quarter,
toll.
a quarter. No, it was a quarter. The toll was a quarter. But we always enjoyed that drive across the causeway.
Mhm.
And I never really minded waiting for the drawbridge. There was always something interesting going on. And of course, the fishermen that lined the bridges, there were always people fishing along the bridge railings. And so I always drove in the inside lane because lots of times they would get something on a hook and step back, you know, and so it was kind of dicey and
Whether
driving.
you get whacked with the fish.
Right. And the mosquitoes were horrendous.
Mhm.
They would, not all the time, they would come in for 2 weeks at a time and you'd just be wild with mosquitoes. And then they'd disappear. And then it was lovely. And I remember you'd come in, I remember hanging clothes on the clothesline and slapping the wet clothes around my legs before I'd hang them up. And if you come in the door, you had to stop and swat all the mosquitoes that had come in with you
I remember
before
those
you went
days.
on
Yeah.
into the house. But anyway, then for 2 weeks it'd be absolutely gorgeous. And of course, we loved the beach club. At that time there wasn't much there,
Mhm.
and at that time we could go just a half a block north, and that's where we built our fires and had our cookouts. You couldn't have a cookout on the beach club property.
But on
But
the
you-
plantation beach, you could.
You could, yes. So, and of course the water was gorgeous here.
Mhm.
Loved the swimming and the boating. So,
And you all built a number of boats while you've lived here.
well, our first boat was one. Remember Gordon? Remember? Yeah. And he bought a boat from a man who had a machine shop over in Miami, and he had built this sailboat that was all metal. It was a little sloop, and that was our first boat, and we called it Little Ironsides. And we sailed that for lots of years. It was on a trailer, though. We had to trailer it from the Crandon Park Marina is where we launched it, because the yacht club wasn't here yet. So, but Gordon built his 30-foot sloop and spent 10 years doing it.
That's
Every
not long
weekend.
in boat building.
Don't forget the dinghies.
Oh yeah, we built sailing dinghies. He built those too. After Little Ironsides, the boat he built was a fiberglass one. And the dinghies were plywood with fiberglass over them, 12-foot sailing dinghies.
And then Silver Buckle came along in the 70s.
Yeah, I think you said we launched it in 1970, right?
1970.
Yeah. And we still have that. It's still docked down at the Key Biscayne Yacht Club.
And I'm not sure if this is correct or not factually, but I think that you and some of the other mothers were the founders of the first Girl Scout troops on Key Biscayne.
Oh, yes, we had, starting with the Brownies
Mm-hmm.
and then the Girl Scouts, and both Jan and Prudence were in our Girl Scout troop. And
Den Mother.
Dead Mother, yeah. And that was wonderful. And my kids all could just walk to school from here, and they all went to Key Biscayne Elementary. Well, there was a small grocery store here, which we would buy things that we needed, just like milk and
Quick
bread
Check.
and stuff. Quick Check. But we went to town for the bulk of our groceries.
And where was town?
Town was Coral Way, and there was a grocery store just a little bit west of 5 Points where we would go, and that there's still a grocery store in that same spot. the Vernon's Drugs was here.
And the post
The only
office.
tele-
And the post office was in
Was
the
in
drugstore.
Vernon's.
Yeah. And
There was a little, there was a little ice cream shop where the town square is now.
yes, there was a little ice cream store in the woods there. It seemed like
It was just south of where the
Village
Jamaica Inn was.
The village,
It was a little tiny one, yeah.
Of course, the Jamaica Inn and the
Mhm.
English pub
Mhm.
were the restaurants that we enjoyed so much. And there was another one.
Do you remember the Mermaid? When the Mermaid opened, it was a silver dollar pancake where the Oasis is now. It was the Little Mermaid.
Oh, yes, it was. You're right.
Mhm. I remember that place. Yeah.
Oh, and I remember when we first came here, Mashta House was still
Mm-hmm.
up, and the community church used to have church services on the porch of Mashta House. It was just beautiful. And my father came to visit, and he used to go fishing down at the lagoon at Mashta House.
Uh huh.
And one day he caught this monster. He didn't know what it was. He brought it home, and it was a crawfish. It was so big, the tail was about 12 inches long. I mean, it was just huge. And it obviously lived there for a long time.
That's kind of startlingly
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask you some of the other things that you did, like with archaeology, when you became involved with that, and how that happened, and then when you were doing a lot of editing, to kind of take us through these other aspects of your professional life on the island.
Oh, well, let me see. How did I get involved with archaeology? I met a friend who introduced me to archaeology. Actually, we took an airboat out to one of the islands in the Glades,
Uh huh.
and this was actually it was out of the Science Museum over on South Bayshore Drive.
Mhm.
And I just got hooked on it. We did a little dig there, and we found all these wonderful things, and then I hooked up with the local archaeological society,
Uh-huh.
and so that's just been a lifelong long kind of avocation for me.
Mhm.
And I did have an opportunity to spend a whole year on the dig that was a salvage dig down where the Hyatt is now downtown by the Brickell
Mhm.
Bridge, and that was a wonderful trip. I've got a photo of our crew,
Oh great! Oh great!
and
What did you find?
well, we found all kinds of bone and pottery. And my friend Joe and I found a Clovis Point, which is a very unusual thing to find. It's a point that's about 6 inches long, and it had to be a trade item because it doesn't come from here.
Here.
And so that was very
So this
exciting.
was it's a Calusa site or Tequesta site? Calusa.
Tequesta,
Tequesta.
Tequesta, yeah, these are,
Now,
but that's, that site was a Tequesta site. It was also a Spanish site, and it
Mhm.
also was an historic site because they had part of the barracks there.
Fort Dallas,
Oh,
right?
Fort
yeah,
Dallas,
yeah.
Mhm. So, but anyway, that was how I got
Mhm.
involved with archaeology. And my son found the only thing that has ever been found that was a piece of carved bone that was human anatomical, and it was little feet and legs, and it's up in the museum in Tallahassee.
So look at that sometime.
Yeah. So anyway, and then I worked with Prudence's mom. We edited several magazines and a book, a bicentennial book called Born of the Sun, which was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was working on an advanced degree and having trouble getting funding. and I had taken classes at the law school, and somebody said, well, why don't you go to law school? And I said, I don't really want to do that.
Oh.
That's not where my best interests are.
Uh-huh.
But I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. And so I went to law school. I was by this time 50 years old. And I went to Nova University and drove my
Youngest
my
son?
Ford
A
Mustang
Oh.
back and forth for
Uh-huh.
3 years, finally graduated, set up my own practice, and I've been practicing ever since.
Law school and met one of the Supreme Court justices, Goldberg.
Law school?
Law school.
Supreme Court Justice Goldberg. And Todd was in school with you?
No, Todd by this time was my second child, and he had gone off to graduate school at the same school where I'd gone in Iowa, Grinnell College. And he and I graduated the same year, 1981. He graduated with his bachelor's degree, and I got my JD. So,
That's great. And then in your law practice, what have you focused on mainly?
well, I started out with just a general civil practice. I decided I was not going to do criminal law because this was in the 80s.
Oh.
And this was, Miami was full of drugs at the time and drug running, and I just didn't want to be in that thing scene at all. So I decided not to do any criminal work. Although I would have people walk into my office and say, would you please represent me?
Uh-huh.
But anyway, we have ended up with a concentration in disability law, and we enjoy that.
And by we, you mean?
My daughter Jan
Uh-huh.
decided that she would go to law school after a career of teaching, and she went to law school about the same time I did, when you were about 50, right?
I graduated when I was 51.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of retiring. I'd always said my office was in a little gray building over on South Miami Avenue, catty corner from Simpson Park. And I always said if I had to leave that office, I was going to quit practicing because it was so wonderful. I could drive up in the little parking lot next door with remnants of the hammock there,
Oh, yeah.
trees. And ever since somebody had bought that whole block, and my lease, when I first signed it, said that I had to leave on 60 days' notice. But the people who bought it kept going bankrupt. And so I ended up being there for 20 years. And I had just finally got a notice I was going to have to leave when Jan went to law school. So I thought, well, I better keep the practice going in case she wants to join me. And which she did. And so she's got the practice now, but we had to move down onto Brickell Avenue out of that wonderful little.
But you practiced together for much longer than you thought you were going to, didn't you?
Much longer. In fact, I'm still working some from home. So I guess that's the story of my professional life, if that's what you wanted.
Gordon worked for FPL.
He worked for FPL? Yeah. How long did you work for FPL?
I don't remember, but until I had my 30 years in the
And what'd you do for FPL?
Well, I was engineer.
Research and development, right?
Well, that, and also worked on a specialty situation, making sure that that the things that were bought would hold up to their recommendations.
You had a test lab. Didn't you?
I had a test lab.
Yeah.
I remember when you brought a bucket full of little pieces of lead, I think it was, and they were shaped like little tiny leaves. And I think that you guys were experimenting with lead to see the properties of lead. And it was so strange what happened to it. You brought it home for us all to see. Beth.
I don't remember that.
And I also remember that you supervised the laying of cable on Biscayne Bay, underneath the bay, under the water.
Oh, well, there was cable. I worked in there too for a while. Underground transmission.
Gordon always was on duty for the hurricanes,
Storm duty.
storm duty. And so he was never home. He always was, he was gone on storm duty because he worked for Florida Power and Life. I want to talk about Betsy.
Betsy, what year was Betsy?
65.
1965.
Yes.
And when we bought the house here, they told us that the water's going to be over the island once every 25 years. And it had been over the island in the 26th storm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in Betsy was a strange storm. It came out of the Bahamas, and it came over toward us, and we started to get ready, and then it went north, and it got all the way up to Jacksonville, and we had relaxed. We've always had this thing where Gordon's sure every storm is coming, and I'm sure every storm is going to miss us. And so Gordon called me in the middle of the day, and he said, did you get everything in from the yard? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the storm turned around and is coming back. And I said, oh, come on, don't. You're pulling my leg. And so he said, no. And so I just ignored him. And about an hour and a half later, he showed up at the front door, and sure enough, it was coming back. And so we had to quick close up the house, and his parents had a house up in North Miami Beach at that time, and that's usually where we went during the storms. So we packed up and we went up to Grandma and Grandpa Reed's for the storm. And of course we came back, and the storm had come straight into Key Biscayne, and our house had flooded. So it was,
How many inches?
I don't know, 6 or 8 inches, I guess.
Uh-huh.
Enough
Figure it was
to,
8.
Yeah.
enough to make our wood parquet come up in a big V down through the living room.
It was like a little mini mountain.
Yeah. And Gordon was building the boat at the time, and he had bought the lead for the keel, and he was storing it out in our carport. And so he went and got all these little, they were clumps of lead that were about as big as my hand, but of course very heavy. And we brought those in and piled them on top of that little mountain in our living room, and it took about 6 months, but the wood dried out and then
it
went back down.
It was this house.
This
Yeah.
house.
Yeah, yeah.
This house.
I remember he had a plumb bob on a tripod to measure the progress.
Could you talk some about the ham radio set, because that's also with all the antennas and taking those down for hurricanes over the
Oh,
years
yeah.
and things. But you have always maintained your ham radio in the house as part of your life.
Oh, yeah.
And still, to this day, you're on your ham radio every day?
Well, yes, every day I'm on a submarine net now. It's on 20 meters. 14343 is the frequency.
He was on a Pearl Harbor survivors net, but they've all
Passed away.
So he was the only one left, so.
Of the
he-
radio operators?
the- Of the Pearl Harbor survivors. net. And so he looked around and he found this net of submariners. So, and he's still part of that, right?
Right.
That's great. But you no longer climb the roof to go get the antenna down when there's a storm, I hope? Someone else does it now?
Well, my son, Todd, who lives up in Falls Church, Virginia, comes down and helps us out. We put the boat up in Pines Canal and tie it up to the mangroves and also put out anchors in the canal. And then he looked over my ham radio and he took down the, the antenna pole that I've got my
How many
antenna.
antennas do you have?
Well, I used to have 4, but now I've only got 1. I only got 1 back up, and that was through the insistence of one of the fellows from the submarine net who lives up in Jupiter.
As far as being on the island, the difference between Andrew and Betsy.
Well, we had tree damage in both of them. We had the house flooded in both of them. We had, I guess, more damage in Andrew, more tree damage, but
Me too.
damage,
House?
the house was about the same, I think. You know,
Did you have to put the lead on the floor?
yes, we did. It came up again, but but as you can see, it went back down again.
Yes.
But I think it's really interesting that we were flooded in 25-year increments, from 65 to 92,
Yeah.
and then the last one, which was Irma, but the water only got as high as our doorstep. It didn't come in the house in Irma. So, but that's another 25 years.
That's 25. Right before Andrew, I was in town, and you two were headed to China on a trip, and Mr. Reed said, you have to all come out on the boat. I have to show you what to do if a hurricane comes, so that you know how, where to take it in Pines Canal and what to do. And so Jan and myself and Todd or Aaron,
I don't know.
we went out on the boat with you, and I remember all of us kids, we were in our late 30s at the time, laughing our guts out, like, a hurricane coming, we haven't had one since Betsy, like, this is not gonna happen. And you were so together about, pay attention, you need to know. And then 4 days later, Andrew was so fast.
So
It built
fast.
and it came, and it was just
Yeah.
4 days later,
Wow.
Andrew was here. I'd flown back.
Yeah, and you
north,
were
but-
supposed to fly to China the day of
The day
Andrew.
of Andrew.
And
And
you-
we took our suitcase with us. We stayed over in Coral Gables, thinking that we maybe could catch up with our tour group later. But then when we saw the terrible mess that the house was in, we felt like we just couldn't leave that mess for our family. And so we gave up our trip to China.
But the boat was safe.
The boat was safe.
Yeah.
The boat was blown over, and it had a couple of stays that were broken. It was down in Pines Canal, but it was okay, which was amazing.
It
I've got a
suffered a
really,
knockdown,
really
but
funny
yeah.
story about that boat.
Okay.
I don't know if you've got time.
No, we got time to go
What?
ahead.
Okay.
The microphone a little bit more, yeah.
All right. Well, after we finally had got the boat going, Gordon was going off some weekend for some guy thing with some other boats. And I was really mad that we were all being left behind. And so I said to Todd, let's take the boat down to Elliott Key for the weekend. And so I said, get somebody to help you with the sails. And I guess he was probably 15, 16, and we had Aaron. So he got a friend, I can't remember his name now, he lived over in Holiday Colony. And Aaron invited David Tuggle from across the road.
How old was Aaron then?
He was probably maybe
10.
7, 8.
Oh.
No, I don't think
Okay.
they were 10. Maybe,
Okay.
maybe he was that old. We took the silver buckle out. We were trailering a dinghy, and we had to make big tacks. So we were way over on the west side of the bay and coming back, and we had used the engine to get out of the slip and put up the sails, and then we were sailing. But we were coming back to Elliott Key, and there's a very narrow channel you have to go through to get down to the south part of Elliott Key. It's called Featherbed Bank. And I was not comfortable to go through there without the engine. And so I said, let's start up the engine, we're almost to Featherbed Bank. Well, the engine ran for like 5 minutes, and it died.
Uh-oh.
And so I thought, whoa, now what are we gonna do? We can't, I don't want to take this boat through Featherbed Bank without a motor. So I said to the guys, we'll go over and we'll anchor for the night over by Sands Key. And I'm really sorry that we can't go ashore to swim, because that's where the sandy beaches were. And so we went over and we anchored off of Sands Key for the night. And it was a really nice night. It was one of these nights where all the phosphorescence is in the water.
Yeah.
And so we were taking buckets full of things up, out of the water and watching everything. So it was really nice. So then I kept thinking, what are we gonna do? How are we gonna get back in the slip when we get back to the yacht club? And so the next morning I was talking to Todd about it, and he said, I think maybe I could tow it in with the dinghy if we got close. And so I said, well, maybe we'll try to. We had to get back. So we sailed back. We had a really nice sail back. So here we are. We're coming. It's Sunday afternoon. Well, you can imagine what Sunday afternoon at the yacht club is like. It's full of people and boats. And so we got close. We took down the sails. And so we shifted the painter of the dinghy around to the bow, and Todd got in. And of course, once you get a boat as heavy as the Silver Buckle going, it's okay. And so he was really, really, really rowing, but he did get it going. But here we are in front of everybody coming into the yacht club with this dinghy towing this big sailboat
This little 15-year-old in
there. So that was very embarrassing, but we got it into the slip fine.
That's great. Jan, were you on that trip?
No, I was not.
No,
Didn't know
she-
anything about it.
So,
I was just trying to think of what it was like in the early days. The telephones, you could only get a party line. And so you either had a 4-party line, or after a while you could get a 2-party line. But the phone would ring for whoever was, and you would answer it even if it wasn't for you. You didn't know who the phone was for.
See, I thought there were different rings in our
Maybe there
house,
were
like
the-
2 minute was us and 1 minute was the other
Oh, maybe
person
that's
or
what
something.
it was. But I remember fighting over the line with people.
Did you know who you shared it with?
Yes, we did.
Are you friends now?
They're gone.
Oh, okay, good.
Oh, shucks. And another thing, when we first moved here, I had a feeling of spaciousness for the island, because there weren't shrubbery or trees down close to the street, and there were these low houses under these big palm trees, and you just it felt spacious in a way that it doesn't anymore.
Sure.
When you first got this house, there were very tall palm trees. There were about 3 in the backyard, 3 in the front yard.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, because it had been a coconut plantation.
But of course, they died in the blight. So. But we've always tried to keep some going.
Was this a Maple house?
Yes.
Big house?
Yes.
And do you remember what you paid for it?
Yes, we paid $14,500, which was rather expensive at the time. But at the time, they hadn't opened up the
North
houses
section.
north, and there were only 3 houses for sale on the key when we were looking. Yeah.
Do they have a sales office?
I don't remember how we. It was not.
They did have a sales office. I
There
think
must
I
have
saw a
had
picture
a
recently.
realtor. I don't recall that, but I do remember what we paid for it.
And was there I don't mean to interrupt, but was there financing? Like, how did you have to pay cash?
Well, this house would already. Most people out here then bought with their GI Bill.
Yeah.
And so, but this house, we assumed the mortgage from the people who owned it. There weren't any houses available that we could buy that way.
They must not have lived here very long.
No, they only lived here a year and a half or so.
But
They attended,
Dad had saved up all his Navy pay.
right.
So you used to
So
have
we
down
had money
payment,
for a
right?
down payment. So,
The only house you lived in
on the key.
on
yes.
the key, and sort of for your entire married life as well.
Almost, yes.
Wow.
You've owned this house since about 1952, right?
Right.
And how many bedrooms, bathrooms?
Well, we have 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, and then we put on an additional bedroom and bath.
And then the lanai?
And yes, and we extended the porch and moved it down that way. So, yeah.
And converted the garage.
And this room over here was a bedroom. Has sometimes been a bedroom and sometimes it's been open.
And you've raised 3 kids here,
3 children, yes.
and you've had at different times grandkids staying with you and
Yes.
grandparents staying with you.
Grandparents staying with us, yes. And my great grandson is coming to visit for the 4th of July with Jan's son and his wife. So we're
I just want to interrupt 1 second because I think this story is really great. If you could tell the Uncle Bob water skiing story before we close.
It's right here.
But maybe you should tell a story because I was just a baby.
Uncle Bob was a bartender at the Key Rendezvous, which was the original bar up here in the shopping center. And he came and he lived with us for several years after we moved down here. And he also had a water ski school where he taught people to water ski. Okay, now you tell the story.
And he did that from the Key Biscayne Hotel? Or where did he do the water skiing school?
In Biscayne Bay.
They were
in the bay. Okay.
They were in the bay.
So Uncle Bob and his partner in the ski school were trying to drum up money. So they hatched onto this idea that Jack Parr was coming down, and they were going to ask him if he would learn to ski at their ski school, and then they wanted him to ski behind the Goodyear blimp. So this was all arranged, and a rope came down from the Goodyear blimp, and Jack Parr was game, and he tried and tried, but he could never get a hold of the rope and get going. He was always falling. So they had the Miami News was filming it or taking pictures at least, and they wanted a story. So Uncle Bob's partner got on skis, and it was far, far away. You couldn't tell who was on skis. So Uncle Bob's partner was the stunt man, And they ran the story, and it looked like Jack Parr was skiing behind the Goodyear blimp, and it made the Miami news. So that was Uncle Bob's 15 minutes of fame
And
there.
what waterway was it in?
It was in Biscayne Bay.
Just off of the key.
I would like to thank the Reeds, Beth and Gordon and Jan, and their lovely dog, Mia, for welcoming us and opening up their home, for doing this really wonderful video, and to just say thank you, because this has been a treat.